Over the last few weeks, several games have had their Denuvo protection removed, either through an update or a leak of the unprotected EXE. This provides us, the gaming community, the opportunity to take a third crack at analysing its impact by comparing performance and loading times before and after Denuvo was removed. All puns aside, we use leaks and legitimate games in this analysis, not cracks. This is the list of games we'll cover. But before we get into our results, let's talk about the methodology used in our tests. We use the game's internal benchmark if one's available, since it's the easiest and most reliable way to create an identical load across the protected and unprotected builds. With that in mind, let's look at Formula 1 2018, the game with the most comprehensive benchmark tool of any Denuvo protected title we've ever tested. F1 2018's benchmark tool has over 21 tracks available to test, and each of them can be set to either clear weather or heavy rain. This gives us 42 points of comparison, by far the largest sample size we've ever tested. How many of them do you think perform better in the unprotected version? What do you estimate the performance difference will be? Leave your prediction in the comment section below. It'll be fun to see how close you were. You wouldn't believe the answer if we told you, so we'll just show you the results the tool spat out. Conveniently for us, the tool displays the minimum and average frame rates on screen after the test is concluded, in addition to recording them in more detail in the XML file. But before we get to the benchmark tool, let's look at how long Formula 1 2018 takes to load the main menu. The Denuvo protected EXE took 81.32 seconds to load the main menu on its first launch, 66 seconds on its second launch, and settled around 49 to 50 seconds on subsequent startups. The unprotected EXE took 18 seconds to load the main menu on its first launch, around 14 to 15 seconds on its second and third startups, and stabilized around 16 seconds on subsequent startups. On their first two launches, the Denuvo protected EXE took around 450% the time the unprotected build took to load the main menu. On subsequent startups though, the Denuvo protected build took around 300% the time the unprotected EXE took to load the main menu. So let's take a closer look at the two EXEs. The Denuvo protected EXE is 254 megabytes, 885% the size of the unprotected EXE, which is just 28.7 megabytes. Crucially, both of the EXEs display the same version, a congruence you will also see in the performance results. Therefore, a discrepancy in performance and loading times cannot be attributed to a difference in product versions. The unprotected EXE is 225.3 megabytes smaller than the Denuvo protected build. In other words, the protected EXE is just 11.3% the size of the Denuvo protected executable. Does that bleed into performance? This is what the benchmark is for. All tests were conducted with the same NVIDIA driver and with all the settings set at their highest. You might have noticed that ambient occlusion has a higher setting available. The only option above HBAO+ is ASSAO, an AMD-specific implementation of the same effect. It is not an upgrade. We didn't run into a GPU bottleneck even with all the settings set to their highest, since we used a stock-clocked second-generation i7 with a 1080 Ti. Since Denuvo is reported to compete for CPU resources rather than the GPU, this is a good setup to test its impact. So without further ado, let's dig into the results by starting with my home, Australia, in clear weather. The Denuvo protected EXE took 19 seconds to load this track, 111.76% the time taken by the unprotected EXE, which took 17 seconds. This is the length of time the game took to load the campaign, so we think it's a good idea to continue measuring how long these benchmark tracks take to load. The Denuvo EXE averaged 90 frames per second with a minimum of 26 frames, while the unprotected build averaged 93 frames per second with a minimum of 71 frames per second. The 273% difference in minimum frame rate is huge, considering the Denuvo protected EXE dips below the critical 30 frames per second needed to perceive smooth motion, while the unprotected EXE stays comfortably above the ideal 60 frames. This is not an isolated incident, so we'll track the number of times this happens with this image. For a better measure of smoothness, let's look at the frame times. Denuvo averaged 11 milliseconds with a maximum of 37.93 milliseconds, while the unprotected EXE averaged 10.67 milliseconds with a maximum of 13.99 milliseconds. If you're wondering why we include both frame rates and frame times, the latter is a more precise measure of smoothness. The maximum frame time indicates how long the most severe stutter lasted. In this case, the Denuvo protected EXE's longest stutter lasted 271.05% as long as the unprotected EXE's maximum frame time. So now let's look at the Australian track's performance with the weather set to heavy rain. Denuvo took 20 seconds to load this track, 149.59% the time taken by the unprotected EXE, which took 13.37 seconds. Denuvo averaged 80 frames per second with a minimum of 54 frames, while the unprotected build averaged 84 frames with a minimum of 66 frames. Again, we see the unprotected build stayed comfortably above the 60 frame threshold, while the Denuvo protected build falters. Moving on to frame times, Denuvo averaged 12.47 milliseconds with a maximum of 18.46, while the unprotected EXE averaged 11.86 milliseconds with a maximum of 14.96 milliseconds. Bahrain in clear weather is next. The Denuvo protected EXE took 14.3 seconds to load this track, 121.29% the time taken by the unprotected EXE, which took 11.79 seconds. Moving on to performance, Denuvo averaged 101 frames per second with a minimum of 65, while the unprotected averaged 113 frames with a minimum of 80. This might not be significant to players using 60Hz monitors, but the difference can be noticed on a higher refresh rate display. Frame times, Denuvo averaged 9.9 milliseconds with a maximum of 15.35. The unprotected averaged 8.82 milliseconds with a maximum of 12.43. Bahrain's performance in heavy rain, Denuvo took 16.22 seconds to load this track, 129.55% the time taken by the unprotected, which took 12.52 seconds. Performance, Denuvo averaged 72 frames with a minimum of 52, while the unprotected build averaged 79 frames with a minimum of 61. This is the third case where the 60 frames per second threshold for smoothness divides a Denuvo protected EXE from the unprotected one. Frame times, Denuvo averaged 13.84 milliseconds with a maximum of 19.14. The unprotected EXE averaged 12.57 milliseconds with a maximum of 16.36 milliseconds. Next is China. Clear weather. Denuvo averaged 99 frames with a minimum of 52, while the unprotected build averaged 102 frames with a minimum of 53. Denuvo's frame times averaged 10.06 milliseconds with a maximum of 18.98, while the unprotected averaged 9.73 milliseconds with a maximum of 18.67. In China heavy rain, Denuvo took 13.4 seconds to load this track, while the unprotected took 12.92 seconds. Denuvo averaged 77 frames a second with a minimum of 47, while the unprotected averaged 80 frames per second with a minimum of 58 frames, an improvement of 23.4%. Denuvo's frame times averaged 12.9 milliseconds with a maximum of 20.98. The unprotected averaged 12.48 milliseconds with a maximum of 17.06. Next is Azerbaijan. In clear weather. The Denuvo protected EXE took 17 seconds to load this track, 120.65% the time taken by the unprotected EXE, which finished loading in 14.09 seconds. For performance, Denuvo averaged 90 frames per second with a minimum of 59 frames, while the unprotected averaged 91 frames with a minimum of 61. This difference of 1 to 2 frames per second may seem insignificant, but this marks a fourth case where the Denuvo protected EXE fails to meet the 60 frames per second threshold while the unprotected EXE scrapes through. Frame times for Denuvo were 11.01 milliseconds with a maximum of 16.68, while the unprotected EXE averaged 10.88 milliseconds with a maximum of 16.26 milliseconds. And what about Azerbaijan with heavy rain? Both versions took around 14 seconds to load this track. Denuvo averaged 74 frames per second with a minimum of 48 frames, while the unprotected EXE averaged 77 frames with a minimum of 55, an improvement of 14.58%. Frame times, Denuvo averaged 13.42 milliseconds with a maximum of 20.65. The unprotected averaged 12.83 milliseconds with a maximum of 17.89. Next is Spain, in clear weather. Denuvo took 17.07 seconds to load this track, 117.08% the time taken by the unprotected EXE, which finished loading in 14.58 seconds. The Denuvo EXE averaged 91 frames per second with a minimum of 59, while the unprotected EXE averaged 94 frames with a minimum of 60 frames per second. Again, this difference appears marginal at first glance, but here this marks the fifth case where the Denuvo protected EXE fails to meet the 60 frames per second threshold, while the unprotected EXE barely scrapes through. Denuvo's frame times averaged 10.9 milliseconds and a maximum of 16.69, and the unprotected averaged 10.54 with a maximum of 16.46. Spain set to heavy rain. Denuvo took 13 seconds to load this track, while the unprotected took 12.8 seconds. Denuvo averaged 69 frames per second with a minimum of 51, while the unprotected averaged 76 frames per second, a 10% improvement, and a minimum of 58 frames per second, an improvement of 13.73%. Denuvo's frame times are 14.41 milliseconds, with a maximum of 19.42. The unprotected frame times averaged 13.13 milliseconds and a maximum of 17.03. Now let's look at Canada in clear weather. The Denuvo protected EXE took 19.39 seconds to load this track, 117.73% the time taken by the unprotected EXE, which finished loading at 16.47 seconds. But looking at performance, the Denuvo protected EXE averaged 86 frames per second with a minimum of 12 frames per second, while the unprotected EXE averaged 93 frames per second with a minimum of 65 frames per second. That's 541.67% the minimum frames of the Denuvo protected EXE. This also marks a sixth instance where the Denuvo build's minimum frame rate failed to meet the 60 frames per second threshold, while the unprotected EXE powered through. Also in this case, Denuvo failed to reach even 30 frames per second, the minimum required to perceive smooth motion during a game, while the unprotected EXE never dipped below the ideal 60 frames per second standard. This is not an isolated incident, so we'll track the number of times this happens with this image. Denuvo's frame times average 11.6 milliseconds with a maximum of 82.28 milliseconds, while the unprotected EXE averaged 10.71 milliseconds with a maximum of 15.23. Denuvo's severest stutter lasted 540.4% as long as the unprotected EXE. And how did Canada perform with the weather set to heavy rain? Denuvo took 14 seconds to load this track, 113.73% the time taken by the unprotected EXE, which finished loading in 12.31 seconds. Moving on to performance, the Denuvo protected EXE averaged 71 frames per second with a minimum of 47, while the unprotected EXE averaged 78 frames per second with a minimum of 54. Denuvo's frame times were 13.94 milliseconds with a maximum of 20.88, while the unprotected EXE averaged 12.67 milliseconds with a maximum of 18.26. So let's jump across now to Britain in clear weather. Denuvo took 17 seconds to load this track, 120.74% the time taken by the unprotected EXE, which finished loading in 14.08 seconds. Denuvo's performance averaged 94 frames per second with a minimum of 22 frames per second, while the unprotected EXE averaged 106 frames with a minimum of 72. This is the seventh case where the 60 frames per second threshold for minimum frame rate separated the two EXEs. And again, in this case, Denuvo failed to reach even 30 frames per second, while the unprotected never dipped below 60 frames per second. Denuvo's frame times were 10.62 milliseconds with a maximum of 44.24. You'd get bored of listening to me read numbers, so we'll just show you the benchmark runs and the results to prove we didn't just make the numbers up. Moving on to Britain in heavy rain. Monaco is next. Moving on to Monaco in heavy rain. Moving on to France. Moving on to France in heavy rain. Next is Austria. Again, we see the unprotected build stay comfortably above the 60 frame threshold, while the Denuvo protected build falters. Now Austria in heavy rain. Again, we see the unprotected build stay comfortably above the 60 frame threshold, while the Denuvo protected build falters. Germany is next. Again, we see the unprotected build stay comfortably above the 60 frame threshold, while the Denuvo protected build falters. Next is Germany in heavy rain. Moving on to Hungary. Again, we see the unprotected build stay comfortably above the 60 frame threshold, while the Denuvo protected build falters. Next is Hungary in heavy rain. Belgium is next. Again, we see the unprotected build stay comfortably above the 60 frame threshold, while the Denuvo protected build falters. Moving on to Belgium in heavy rain. Italy is next. Again, we see the unprotected build stay comfortably above the 60 frame threshold, while the Denuvo protected build falters. Moving on to Italy with heavy rain. Singapore is next. Now let's look at Singapore with heavy rain. Again, we see the unprotected build stay comfortably above the 60 frame threshold. Denuvo failed to reach even 30 frames per second. Russia is next. Again, we see the unprotected build stay comfortably above the 60 frame threshold. Russia with heavy rain. Japan is next. Now let's look at Japan and heavy rain. Again, we see the unprotected build stay comfortably above the 60 frame threshold. USA is next. Now let's look at USA in heavy rain. Again, we see the unprotected build stay comfortably above the 60 frame threshold. Mexico is next. Now let's look at Mexico and heavy rain. Brazil is next. And how did Brazil perform with the weather set to heavy rain? If we put all the benchmarks together, on average, the unprotected EXE had a 42.47% lead in minimum frame rates and a 7.14% lead in average frame rates. There were a few tracks we omitted from our test. These were just shorter variants of tracks we've already benchmarked, but every one of the tracks we tested performed better with the unprotected EXE. There were only a few tracks that displayed identical performance in either minimum or average frame rates, but never both. If this still isn't proof games perform better without Denuvo, then what is? If you're still not convinced, let's look at our benchmark of Yakuza Zero. The Denuvo EXE is 224 meg, 11.67 times the size of the unprotected build at 19.2 meg. The game's EXE shed 204.8 megabytes when Denuvo was removed, dropping down to 8.57% of its previous size. Is this reflected at all in its performance? Yakuza's Denuvo EXE averaged 148.063 frames per second, with a minimum of 19, while the unprotected EXE averaged 160 frames per second, with a minimum of 62. This is the 18th case where the 60 frames per second threshold for minimum frame rate separated the two EXEs. And additionally, this also marks the 5th case the Denuvo EXE failed to stay above the 30 frames per second threshold, while the unprotected EXE never dipped below the ideal 60 frames per second. Here are the identical settings we used to test both EXEs. Denuvo's frame times averaged 6.754 milliseconds, with a maximum of 345.198 milliseconds, while the unprotected EXE averaged 6.249 milliseconds with a maximum of 90.758. And now Sonic Mania, a game that famously had its Denuvo protection fortified before it was eventually removed. There is perhaps no bigger indicator of this than the file size. The Denuvo EXE is 128 meg, 43.24 times the size of the unprotected build, which clocks in at just 2.96 meg. The game shed 125.04 megabytes when Denuvo was removed, dropping down to a minuscule 2.3% of its former size. Let's look at one problem allegedly caused by this bloated implementation. Denuvo was blamed for slowing the game down to a crawl if you navigated to the time attack and replay menus. Sure enough, we were able to reproduce this issue with the Denuvo build. This wasn't the case after Denuvo was removed. The game worked fine even after we browsed through the time attack and replays menu. This seems to confirm Denuvo's role in this slowdown. But did Denuvo have an impact outside of this scenario? Let's look at load times before and after Denuvo was removed. The game took around 40 to 50 seconds to load the main menu before Denuvo was removed, and around 22 seconds after the removal. In other words, Denuvo doubled loading times for Sonic Mania. And next we have Hitman 2. The Denuvo EXE is 266 meg, 7.62 times the size of the unprotected build, which clocks in at just 34.9 meg. The game shed 231.1 megabytes when Denuvo was removed, dropping down to 13.12% of its former size. Hitman 2 has 2 maps available in its benchmark tool. Miami proved impossible to benchmark due to issues with instability. So let's look at the results for Mumbai. Before Denuvo was removed, the game took 65.58 seconds to load Mumbai and averaged 42.79 frames per second on its first run, dropping slightly to 42.08 frames on subsequent runs. After Denuvo was removed, Mumbai took 39 seconds to load and averaged 48.54 frames on its first run, rising to 52.05 frames on subsequent runs. And finally, let's look at Devil May Cry 5. The Denuvo EXE weighs in at a whopping 483 megabytes, 3.77 times the size of the unprotected build, which clocks in at just 128 meg. The unprotected EXE is 355 meg lighter, 26.5% of its former size. Playing Devil May Cry 5 using the Denuvo protected EXE was a rough experience because the game would stutter incredibly frequently, on many occasions multiple times each second. However, Shadowplay introduced its own stutters in the footage recorded from both the Denuvo and unprotected EXEs, in addition to the other games in this video. If you're a subscriber, you might remember we've run into this issue in earlier videos. Unfortunately, we're no closer to finding the cause or indeed solution. Shadowplay's stutters were not perceived during gameplay and were later introduced in the footage by the recording process. You can tell the difference between in-game and Shadowplay stutters by keeping an eye on the frame time counter on the top right. In-game stutters should be reflected in a spike on the graph, while Shadowplay stutters will not. We've benchmarked 5 sequences to test for performance differences in a diverse set of scenarios. These are the identical settings we used to test both EXEs. We maxed everything except for motion blur. Our first benchmark starts with a prologue and ends with the conclusion of the first boss fight. Both versions took around 22 seconds to load this sequence. The unprotected EXE averaged 123.201 frames, with a minimum of 35, while the Denuvo EXE averaged 120.423 frames, with a minimum of 0. How is that possible, you might ask? The answer lies in frame times. The Denuvo protected EXE averaged 8.30407 milliseconds, with a maximum of 1,179.158 milliseconds. This means the Denuvo EXE took, at some point, more than a second to render a single frame. In other words, there was at least 1 second during which the Denuvo EXE displayed 0 new frames. As for the unprotected EXE, frame times averaged 8.117 milliseconds, with a maximum of 353.822. Our second benchmark of this game is the game's first cutscene, which also serves as the opening credits. The Denuvo EXE averaged 85.405 frames per second with a minimum of 55, while the unprotected EXE averaged 91.75 frames with a minimum of 63. This is the 19th case where the 60 frames per second threshold for minimum frame rate separated the two EXEs. Denuvo's frame times averaged 11.709 milliseconds with a maximum of 96.466. The unprotected EXE's frame times averaged 10.899 milliseconds, with a maximum of 106.474. Our third test for Devil May Cry 5 is a sequence that first introduces you to the Devil Breaker. Denuvo averaged 93.114 frames per second with a minimum of 0, while the unprotected EXE averaged 114.645 frames with a minimum of 83. Once again, this is now the 20th case where the 60 frames per second threshold for minimum frame rates separated the two EXEs. And this is also the 6th case the Denuvo protected EXE failed to stay above the 30 frames per second threshold, while the unprotected EXE never dipped below the ideal 60 frames per second standard. To make matters worse, this is the second case where the Denuvo EXE has dropped to a minimum of 0 frames per second. Denuvo's frame times average 10.73983 milliseconds, with a maximum of 5,182.646 milliseconds. That's a little over 5 seconds between frames. As for the unprotected EXE, frame times average 8.724 milliseconds with a maximum of 35.579. The next Devil May Cry 5 benchmark is when we fight the evil plant. Denuvo averaged 102.157 frames per second with a minimum of 0 again, while the unprotected EXE averaged 115.295 frames with a minimum of 67. This is now the 21st case where Denuvo failed to maintain the 60 frames per second standard. And, additionally, this also marks the 7th case where Denuvo failed to maintain 30 frames per second, while the unprotected EXE never dipped below the ideal 60 frames per second standard. To make matters worse, this is the 3rd case where the Denuvo EXE has dropped to a minimum of 0 frames per second. The Denuvo EXE averaged 9.908 milliseconds with a maximum of 1,381 milliseconds, whilst the unprotected EXE's frame times averaged 8.68 milliseconds with a maximum of 84.464. And now our final benchmark, the Clyfoth mission. Denuvo took 40 seconds to load this mission on its first run, dropping to 30 on subsequent runs. The unprotected EXE took 19.34 seconds to load this mission on its first run, dropping to 17.13 seconds on subsequent runs. Denuvo averaged 74.484 frames per second with a minimum of 0 again, while the unprotected averaged 89.778 frames with a minimum of 34. So here's a 4th case where Denuvo has dropped to a minimum of 0 frames per second. The Denuvo protected EXE averaged 13.761 milliseconds, with a maximum of 6,375.441 milliseconds. That's almost 6.5 seconds between frames. As for the unprotected EXE, frame times average 11.14 milliseconds with a maximum of 201.16 milliseconds. So that concludes our 3rd test of Denuvo's impact on game performance. We will continue to make videos like this when more games have Denuvo removed, so please like, subscribe and press the bell button if you haven't already. If you like this video, please share it. We also have a secondary channel, so please subscribe to that too, and press the bell button. While you're here, feel free to watch our playlist on Denuvo's history and performance impact, which includes the videos we referenced earlier. Also, our analysis of the Battlefield franchise and our hardware analysis of CPUs and GPUs.